Imagine reaching the pinnacle of glory, having unimaginable riches, wisdom beyond any man, and a kingdom that prospers like no other. Now imagine losing all of that through a series of wrong choices. This is exactly what happened to Solomon, the wisest king in the history of Israel. From promising heir to protagonist of one of the greatest tragedies in the Bible, his life is a true manual of success and failure. He built a powerful empire, erected the majestic temple of God, and became rich like no one else. But in the end, his political alliances and personal desires led to his ruin. How could such a wise man fall so low? In this video, we dive into the rise and fall of King Solomon. You will see how small missteps can turn into great tragedies, and you will learn valuable lessons about leadership, power, wealth, and obedience to God. After all, his story is not just an ancient tale, but a living warning to us all. What really destroyed Solomon? How did he go from a glorious king to a repentant and embittered man? He died reflecting on his mistakes, aware that all his glory was not enough to prevent his decline. And above all, what can we learn from their mistakes so as not to repeat the same fate? Get ready, because this story could change the way you see success in life. Solomon began his reign with unique brilliance. His father, David, had consolidated Israel as a power, but it was up to him to transform this base into something even greater. From the beginning, his priority was to seek wisdom, and God answered his request in an extraordinary way. It not only gave him understanding to rule, but also riches and glory, placing him above all the kings of his time. His name became synonymous with justice and discernment, and soon his fame went beyond the borders of Israel. With this wisdom, Solomon ruled with unquestionable justice. His most famous trial, the case of two women who fought over a baby, demonstrated to the world his ability to see the truth beyond appearances. This episode was not only a milestone of his intelligence, but also a symbol of the type of leader he was. A king who did not make impulsive decisions and knew when to listen before acting. The people felt safe under their government, as there was confidence in their ability to decide fairly. But his greatest work, the one that would define his era, was the construction of the Temple of God in Jerusalem. This project, dreamed of by David, became reality under the leadership of Solomon. The temple was not just a sumptuous building covered in gold and precious stones, but the materialization of the covenant between God and Israel. The dedication of this temple was a grand event, marked by sacrifices and a prayer that demonstrated the king's humility and devotion. It was the height of his connection with God. Israel's prosperity grew along with its reputation. Trade flourished, diplomatic alliances strengthened the nation, and neighboring peoples sought the favor of the wise king. Gold and silver multiplied in Jerusalem, and there was no war to weaken the kingdom. Solomon had everything any ruler could want: power, wealth, peace, and divine blessing. It seemed that nothing could destabilize his reign. His advice was so valuable that even the famous Queen of Sheba traveled great distances just to test him with riddles and hear his wisdom. Seeing the splendor of the palace, the order in its court, and the grandeur of the temple, she was impressed. He admitted that not even half of his glory had been told. This external recognition only reinforced the image that Solomon was the greatest leader of his time, a living example that wisdom brings success. However, even at its peak, seeds of its future ruin were already being sown. Small, seemingly harmless details began to accumulate. In his quest for greatness, Solomon made choices that, at first, did not seem dangerous. But what starts as a simple detour can end up as a road of no return. The problem was not the wisdom he possessed, but rather what he would do with it in the years to come. Solomon's reign was marked by unprecedented prosperity. Under his leadership, Israel experienced a golden period, both figuratively and literally. Jerusalem became a vibrant commercial center, where merchants brought precious goods from distant lands. Gold flowed in abundance, and silver became so common that, according to the Bible, it was considered of little value. The king had transformed his kingdom into an influential commercial empire, connected to several nations. The secret of his wealth was his strategic intelligence. Solomon not only accumulated gold and precious stones, but he knew how to use them to strengthen his position. He established profitable trade routes, made alliances with foreign kings, and invested in Israel's growth. Their relationship with the Phoenicians, masters of navigation, brought a continuous flow of valuable commodities such as cedar from Lebanon and ivory. He was not only wise but also a business visionary. Solomon's building projects also reflected his grandeur. In addition to the Temple of God, he erected imposing palaces, fortresses, and fortified cities. His palace, in particular, was a work of art, filled with luxurious details. Every structure built under his command reinforced the idea that Israel was not only a strong kingdom spiritually, but also materially. He had managed to unite faith and progress in a balance that impressed the world. His fame grew to the point of attracting foreign leaders, who came not only to see his wealth, but also to listen to his advice. The visit of the Queen of Sheba is the greatest example of this. Upon arrival, she was not only amazed at the grandeur of the kingdom, but recognized that Solomon's wisdom was even greater than his wealth. This was the key to his success. He knew that intelligence and discernment were worth more than any treasure. However, the more wealth he accumulated, the more his confidence in himself grew. He began to seek security not only in the wisdom and presence of God, but also in gold, political agreements, and power. This was a fine line, barely noticeable at first, but extremely dangerous. Success can be a blessing, but it can also be a test, and it's not always easy to know when you're about to fail. At the height of his glory, Solomon still seemed unshakable. His wisdom guided him, his wealth multiplied, and his name was respected everywhere. But the real proof was not in his ability to achieve all of this, but in his ability to manage success without getting lost along the way. Small slips began to appear, and each one of them, no matter how small, took him a little further away from the original purpose of his reign. The problem with mistakes is that, at first, they seem insignificant. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, began to make decisions that, taken alone, did not seem dangerous. He made political alliances by marrying foreign princesses, accumulated wealth beyond what was necessary, and expanded his army with horses and chariots from Egypt. Small details? Perhaps. But God had already warned that a king of Israel should not act like this. Still, Solomon trusted that his wisdom would keep him in control. Over time, his quest for greatness began to create an extravagant lifestyle. He built luxurious palaces, fortified cities, and imposed heavy taxes on the people to keep his empire running. At first, no one complained. After all, the kingdom prospered. But history shows us that wealth and stability can mask deeper problems. The same people who had previously applauded him began to feel the weight of the burden he imposed. Another detail that went unnoticed was his growing attachment to gold and power. Solomon had been blessed with more riches than any other king, but the question was, how long would he know how to manage this prosperity without letting himself be dominated by it? His heart was no longer as focused on God as it had been in the beginning. He still offered sacrifices and prayed, but something had subtly changed. His true pleasure was in his personal glory, no longer in obedience to the Creator. The biggest danger of small mistakes is that they accumulate, and before we realize it, we are already very far from where we should be. Solomon still saw himself as a faithful leader, but in practice he was ignoring principles that supported his greatness. He trusted his own intelligence so much that he began to believe he could balance everything, honor God and, at the same time, follow his own desires. But, as history proves, you cannot serve two masters. God's warnings were clear. Moses had already warned about the dangers that could corrupt a king, and the prophets certainly did not fail to give their warnings. But Solomon, surrounded by success, thought he could manage the consequences. It didn't fall all at once. The decline was gradual, imperceptible to outsiders. And so, like a ship veering slightly off course, he began to sail towards disaster without realizing the size of the risk. His small slips had not yet led to ruin, but the base was already compromised. What seemed like a series of harmless decisions would soon become a problem that was impossible to ignore. Success had been his greatest ally, but now it began to become his greatest enemy. And like any great story of rise and fall, arrogance and excessive self-confidence would be the final push towards his downfall. Success can be a blessing or a trap, and Solomon began to experience both sides of that coin. In the beginning, his wisdom came from a humble heart before God. But over time, he came to trust his own abilities more than divine guidance. After all, who could question the wisest king in history? His prosperous reign and worldwide fame made him feel untouchable. The problem with arrogance is that it blinds us, making it impossible to perceive the exact moment we are about to fall. Solomon's conviction in his own intelligence caused him to begin to ignore limits that he previously respected. He believed he could maintain control, that his decisions were above divine warnings. His political agreements, his numerous marriages, and his increasing accumulation of wealth were seen as clever strategies. But little by little he was fashioning a reign based on his own will, no longer on God's will. This was even reflected in the way he governed. Previously, Solomon was known for his justice, but now he imposed heavy taxes and used forced labor to support his ambitions. That king who began asking for wisdom to serve the people now saw the people as a means to sustain his greatness. Pride quietly transformed his leadership, and those who once admired him began to feel the weight of his decisions. Arrogance also prevented him from listening to advice. Early in his reign, he looked to God and the prophets for guidance. But now, surrounded by riches and sycophants, there was no room for criticism. The wise man who previously taught about humility and prudence now ignored the same truths he once proclaimed. Pride creates a false sense of invincibility, and Solomon began to believe that he could continue to make mistakes without consequences. Worst of all, arrogance doesn't destroy right away, it erodes slowly. The king still considered himself blessed, still offered sacrifices to God, but his faith was divided. The more power he accumulated, the less he depended on the Creator. History is full of examples of leaders who fell just when they believed they were at the top. And Solomon, the wisest man of his generation, did not realize that he was heading towards exactly this destiny. The danger of arrogance is that it convinces a person that everything is under control, even when everything has already started to fall apart. Small slips became conscious choices, and conscious choices would soon become apostasies. The king who had begun his rule with a humble prayer now saw himself as master of his own destiny. But, as we will see below, this exaggerated confidence led him to a fatal error that would seal his downfall. Solomon knew that power is not sustained only with wisdom and riches. To maintain the stability of his kingdom, he resorted to a common strategy among monarchs of the time: political marriages. These alliances guaranteed peace treaties and strengthened ties with other nations. The more weddings he performed, the more his influence expanded. However, what seemed like a smart move soon turned out to be a devastating mistake. He not only multiplied wives, but brought customs and beliefs into Israel that challenged faith in the true God. At first, these foreign women were just part of his government strategy. Princesses from Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and other lands arrived at his palace as symbols of power and diplomacy. But politics soon turned into something deeper. Solomon began to become emotionally attached to these women, and with that, to absorb their religious influences. The king, who was supposed to be a spiritual example for Israel, now allowed his home to be a space for worshiping strange gods. The impact of this went beyond the personal scope. As ruler, he not only tolerated these practices, but also facilitated their spread. To please his wives, he built altars to pagan deities such as Ashtaroth, Molech, and Chemosh. The man who had erected the most magnificent temple to God now sponsored places of worship for foreign gods. And so, what began as a simple political strategy became one of the greatest acts of spiritual betrayal in Israel's history. This change had a direct effect on the people. If the king himself, God's chosen leader, was involved in idolatry, why couldn't the Israelites do the same? Spiritual corruption began to spread, and slowly the nation that had been blessed to follow the divine ways began to drift away. Solomon's example was powerful, but unfortunately, he was now leading Israel into error rather than righteousness. Alliances that were supposed to bring stability ended up bringing division. Solomon was no longer the same man he was at the beginning of his reign. His heart was divided, and his loyalty to God became increasingly fragile. The wisdom that once guided him was now suffocated by his passions and political commitments. The problem was never the marriage itself, but rather the influence these relationships had on his faith. In the end, these fatal alliances not only compromised Israel's spirituality, but also planted the seeds for what would come later. A divided kingdom, a people separated from God, and a king who, upon realizing his mistake, was too old to undo the damage caused. But Solomon's fall was not yet complete. The next step would be the total decay of their faith, and the consequence of this would forever change the history of Israel. What began with small concessions soon turned into a spiral of spiritual decay. Solomon, who had once dedicated his life to God and built the grandest temple in Israel, now erected altars to foreign gods. The same king who wrote proverbs about obedience and fear of the Lord allowed his faith to be contaminated. Gold, power, and passions had blinded him. His heart was no longer exclusively for God. Idolatry did not happen overnight. First, Solomon only allowed his wives to practice their rituals. Then, he began to build places of worship for them. Eventually, he became involved in these practices himself, offering sacrifices and participating in pagan rituals. This was not just a personal betrayal, it was a direct affront to the covenant between God and Israel. The king chosen to lead the people to justice was now leading the nation to perdition. God had already warned about the dangers of idolatry, and Solomon knew these warnings well. He knew that Israel only prospered as long as it remained faithful to the Lord. However, instead of listening to God's voice, he chose to go his own way. Idolatry corrupted his judgment, and little by little the wise king began to act like the pagan rulers around him. He was no longer the same leader who had ruled with justice and divine fear. The consequences of this decadence did not take long to emerge. The kingdom that was once united and prosperous began to show signs of weakening. The people, seeing the example of the king himself, also turned away from God. Solomon's government, which was supposed to be a reflection of divine wisdom, became a stage for corruption, greed, and spiritual alienation. The temple, which had been built as a symbol of God's presence, now shared space with altars to worship false gods. Idolatry not only affected his relationship with God, but it also destroyed the foundation of his leadership. Solomon lost the respect of the people, and discontent began to grow. The king who was once celebrated for his wisdom now saw his glory crumble. What he had built over decades was beginning to fall apart. But the worst was yet to come. God's judgment on their errors was about to be decreed. Solomon's fate was already sealed. God does not ignore disobedience, and a king who should be an example ended up becoming a warning for future generations. Idolatry was the point of no return, and the consequences would be irreversible. What would happen to Israel after the fall of its greatest king? Divine judgment was about to be announced, and the weight of punishment would fall not just on Solomon, but on the entire kingdom. God never fails to warn before acting, and with Solomon it was no different. Just as he warned other kings before him, God sent clear signs that the path he was taking would lead to ruin. Prophets and spiritual leaders tried to warn him about the consequences of his idolatry and arrogance. But Solomon, the wisest man in the world, chose to ignore these warnings. His confidence in his own intelligence prevented him from realizing that he was about to suffer the consequences of his mistakes. The first warning was in the law of Moses itself. God had already instructed that the kings of Israel were not to accumulate horses, accumulate excess gold, or marry foreign women to form alliances. Solomon did exactly the opposite. He knew the scriptures, he knew the words of God, and yet he chose to follow his own desires. The worst trap of sin is to make it seem like everything is under control, when in fact the path has already been lost. The prophets were also sent to warn him, but Solomon would not listen. Surrounded by riches, power, and sycophants, he no longer listened to the voices that really mattered. How many times are we warned before making a wrong decision? How many times do we insist on a path that we know is not right? Solomon didn't fall all at once. He was warned, had opportunities to repent, but chose to ignore it. Even with divine patience, the moment came when God decided to act. He appeared to Solomon and gave a stern warning. If he continued on the path of idolatry, the kingdom would be divided after his death. This was a terrible prophecy, as it meant that everything he had built with so much effort would crumble. Wealth, power, and prestige would not be enough to prevent divine judgment. But even so, Solomon did not change his behavior. The danger of ignoring warnings is that when the consequence arrives, there is no turning back. Solomon, who had everything to end his life in glory, now saw the cracks in his empire becoming irreversible. He realized too late that his self-confidence had blinded him. His disobedience would not only affect his life, but also the entire nation of Israel. His mistake would not end with him, but it would have a devastating effect for generations. And so, the wisest king in history ignored the warnings and went his own way. But God's judgment was inevitable. The promise to divide the kingdom was not an empty threat, it was a decree. Now the question was no longer whether Solomon would face the consequences, but when they would be fulfilled. Punishment was at the door, and Israel would never be the same again. God's patience is great, but not infinite. Solomon ignored the warnings, and now it was time to face the consequences. The king who began his reign with divine blessing and lived at the height of glory now saw his empire threatened. God decreed that because of his idolatry and disobedience, the kingdom of Israel would be divided after his death. What Solomon built with so much wealth and wisdom would crumble before his own eyes. The punishment did not come immediately, but the signs were already in the air. Revolts began to emerge, and the climate of dissatisfaction grew among the people. Solomon, who had previously been seen as a fair and wise leader, was now criticized for his heavy taxes and uncontrolled ostentation. The kingdom was cracking, and the king, who was supposed to be a symbol of stability, had become the very reason for the crisis. As part of divine judgment, God raised adversaries to destabilize Solomon. Hadad, an Edomite who had fled years before, returned to challenge the king's power. Rezin, a Syrian leader, began attacking Israel's borders. And within the kingdom itself, Jeroboam, one of his servants, received a prophecy that he would rule over the 10 tribes that would separate from Israel. God was preparing the promised division, and Solomon could do nothing to stop it. This moment came as a shock to the king. For the first time, he realized he wasn't in control. Not all his wealth, power, or influence could reverse the divine decree. He tried to stop Jeroboam, but it was too late. What had been established by God could not be annulled. Solomon's fall did not happen just because of his mistakes, but because he did not know how to repent while there was still time. God's judgment was not just a punishment for Solomon, but a warning for the entire nation of Israel. The covenant with God was not only based on blessings, but also on faithfulness. Solomon failed in this commitment, and his punishment was to see the kingdom he built on the brink of fragmentation. The man who had started with everything now saw his glory crumble before his eyes. Divine punishment was decreed, but the worst for Solomon was yet to come. When someone turns away from God, the void that remains cannot be filled with gold, fame, or power. Solomon was about to face the greatest crisis of his life, the weight of regret and bitter reflection on what he had lost. The wisest king in the world would now become a man tormented by his own conscience. In the last years of his life, Solomon finally realized the depth of his mistakes. He had achieved everything a man could wish for: wealth, power, knowledge, and prestige. However, when he looked back, he only saw vanity. Everything he built, the entire empire he built, was about to fall apart. His greatness was not enough to prevent his own decline, and the glory he once enjoyed now seemed too heavy a burden to carry. It was at this time that he wrote Ecclesiastes, one of the most profound and reflective books in the Bible. In it, Solomon does not boast of his achievements, but admits the futility of a life focused only on riches and pleasures. Vanity of vanities, everything is vanity, he wrote, recognizing that without God, nothing has meaning. He who was once acclaimed for his wisdom now shared a very different teaching. True success lies not in what one achieves, but in remaining faithful to the Creator. His regret, although sincere, was not enough to prevent the consequences of his actions. The kingdom of Israel was already doomed to division, and its history would become a warning for all future generations. The lesson he learned the hard way was that wisdom without obedience is worthless. He knew the right path, but he chose to ignore it, and he paid a heavy price for it. We're often like Solomon. We think we can deal with our small mistakes, that we have everything under control, that our decisions won't have major impacts. But the story of this king teaches us that a simple detour can lead to a destination completely different from what was planned. He started with everything going for him and ended up alone, frustrated and aware that his life could have been much more than it was. Solomon's great legacy is not just in the temple he built or the wealth he accumulated, but in his final words. Ecclesiastes reminds us that true wisdom is not in the unbridled pursuit of success, but in fearing God and keeping His commandments. In the end, what really matters is not what we achieve, but who we live for. Solomon died reflecting on everything he did, leaving behind a kingdom that would never be the same. His story is a powerful testimony to the danger of pride and disobedience, but also a call for each of us to learn from our mistakes. The question that remains is, will we make the same mistakes, or will we have the humility to learn from them before it is too late? Solomon's story is a living warning to us all. He had wisdom, power, wealth, and a unique opportunity to leave an unshakable legacy. But in the end, his choices led him to lose what mattered most, his communion with God. How many times do we seek success without realizing that, if we are not focused on what really matters, everything can become just vanity? Maybe you have already experienced achievements in life, but are you putting your trust in the right things? What we learn from Solomon is that it is not enough to have intelligence, talent, or opportunities. If we don't have solid principles and humility to obey, we can end up wasting everything. Even the wisest man in the world fell because he ignored this truth. Looking at his life, the question remains, what are you building? Are you investing your energy in something that really has value, or are you just accumulating wealth and status that will ultimately mean nothing? Solomon teaches us that success without purpose is a sandcastle. Sooner or later, it crumbles. The biggest lesson from this story is simple. Never trust your own understanding so much that you ignore the right warnings. There is always time to change, to correct the course before it is too late. But the longer we postpone this decision, the more difficult it can be to return. If this content made you reflect, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Together, we can learn from the past to build a better future.